So I think that the things that we've always focused on as a community are starting to become more and more and more important. That last point, which is, HCI started thinking about novices and experts, right? And I'm sort of back to thinking about some of that early training wheels work and some of that early work which was really about how do you give people the tools to interrogate the system and get a mental model of what the system is. Never has that been more important than when you start to have a set of distributed systems and embedded systems that are talking to each other. Surfacing and visualizing what's happening under the hood and supporting mental models that allow people to be able to debug systems is going to get more and more and more important. And so, I think that this is an incredible time for people who are from HCI and user experience who know how to do evidence-based investigation and evidence collection for thinking about speculative futures that are based on the fundamentals of human action and interaction and cooperation with technology. So I actually think that this world that we're moving into needs the kinds of skills that we've been using and developing and extending and reflecting on. Everything from the tactical, in-the-moment usability with a specific single device, through to understanding how the service ecosystems are managed by people. And that has to be people first. It has to be people first. And I think we've done a lot of things about, saying, make the user experience of the product the best. And we are now having to move into thinking about, make the user be the best user they want to be, with the tools and services that we are allowing them to collage, connect, and help to cooperate effectively, with the tools that allow them to interrogate and understand. And I think that also comes to thinking about things like personal data, right? So we're moving into that world where people are starting to become they're not novices about that, they're starting to understand what that means and how to manage it and use it themselves. So I think we're in a really exciting moment.
Well, there's I'll ask one more question and then I'll open up to the floor if there's any other questions. So you may have some questions in a moment. But that's a lovely segue to, I know many people here they come with a lot of variety of experience, and some people may be new to UX. And probably coming from left field in UX, and you might see that they have a career in UX over the long term. So what if someone was starting out in usability or user experience, and they were seeking to forge a career in the area, a long-term career, in sort of 5 to 10 to 20 years, what sort of advice might you give somebody who want to embrace this area as a serious career choice?
Well, I think there are various career tracks, but I was executive vice president of ACM SIG-Chi for 6 years and on the committee as vice president of chapters for 2 years before that. So it will not surprise you for me to say, join up with professional organizations. Join up with whether it's ACM SIG-Chi or the OSCI organization or UXPA or IXDA or whatever it is. I really strongly recommend joining in the conversation to learn from others who are in the field, to share the ideas that you've got, and to start to see what aspect you might be interested in going and working on. So, when I worked on, with the user experience folks in Yahoo, finance, it was very different from working on a lot of the social media properties that I worked on. And these were slightly, they're different kinds of services, different kinds of engagements. When I worked at eBay, and I was thinking a lot about shopping and recommendations and sellers and buyers and the notion of a platform, which is basically a sort of matchmaking platform for people with services and so forth and products, and thinking about the circulation of goods. It was a little different, right? So if you're coming into the field, think about what area you might like to work in, and join professional bodies to have conversations. And there's so many resources online right now. I really recommend reading around and joining discussion groups and just really reading. And I think the career that we have going forward as a user experience HCI career is really about making this conversation one that businesses understand the long-term strategic benefits of having good user experience, as well as the tactical user experience folks and jobs that are on the ground. And you know, I look at startups, and increasingly startups, certainly in Silicon Valley, are bringing on user experience folks early because they're recognizing that a good complement to a competitive analysis for the field you might want to move into, and a good differentiator for your product is to understand what actual humans actually do, and to understand how mock-ups and prototypes and ethnographic work and in the wild prototypes help you shape your product. And that's what we're extremely good at doing. So I think that the long-term career is about the conversations and the communities, and about making sure that the broader world understands the strategic role that we play as well as the tactical role.
Okay.
And I think contributing what you learn, speaking out about what you learn, and talking. A lot of us work on proprietary stuff, but you can go to an evening and you can share methodology development. Another thing that we are really good at is developing innovative methods that keep pace with and or predict the technologies that are coming along. We've had to do that because we're a transformatory and not just a reactive but a proactive discipline that starts to come in and say, here are the business metrics for success that you have as a company. Let me explain what some new metrics might look like, which are actually about user engagement and user happiness and user experience for the product. And that's a really important role. And you can start to develop those conversations and those abstract methods and metrics with others who are in your community, and go back and transform businesses without giving anything proprietary away. But you can come back and say, look, there's something interesting going on here. I wonder if we should have a new measure or metric that's about a business key indicator. I'm writing a book at the moment with Churchill from Spotify. And what we're trying to do is talk to designers and UX professionals about the importance of data science, and not say you need to be a data scientist, but say you need to be part of the conversation with data scientists about measures, metrics, and behavioral and analytics at scale, because that will inform the designs going forward. But as a designer and a UX professional, you can often say, here are the right things to go and measure to make predictions about the uptake of some technology tool or service for the future. And so, I really think that staying in the community, talking to others and learning from each other about the methods, the uses of data, the kinds of questions that are coming up for you, is really important. Because if you stick in your silo or stick by yourself and only read books and blogs, I don't think you get to have as much of a input, learning, and effect on the field at large. And we need to all help each other learn going forward, because we are not simply a reactive discipline, we are a proactive leadership discipline, and I think we often don't talk about that enough with each other or in general.
One of the good words. Okay, I might throw it to the floor. Yes, Sharon. You were very fast.
Sorry. There you go.
Thanks. Thank you, Elizabeth, but you're making me very nervous. The bulk of my work in my career as a UX designer has been really as a UI designer. And like many of the people in this room, the bulk of what I do is generate specifications, and I use that word specific specifications for user interfaces. Here's the page for that, here's the screen for that, here's the dialogue for that, here's what the IVR will say in this specific circumstance. But when you talk about generative experiences being generated dynamically from large amounts of data, and when we combine with that speech-based and gesture-based interfaces, and when we combine with that the Internet of Things and good old ambient computing, I worry about how we, or whether we will continue to design user interfaces, because as these new products and services basically generate interactions dynamically, we don't get to say, and here's the screen for that, and here's the page for that, and here's the form for that. And I can't help feeling that we're really stretching the limits of what we can do with these specifications, and to some extent, deliberately perhaps ignoring the reality of what's coming. And fortunately, mobile devices have brought us a little bit of time, because we've gone back to very small, contained interactions that we can design. But once that breaks, I just wonder what the future of UX design is, or designers, when we can't really design a user interface, but perhaps we can design an experience, but how do we specify that? I'm nervous, help me.
There are many answers to that question, but screens are likely to always be around. So I think there's a conflation here between the expertise that you have understanding how people interact with information. So thinking about information presentation and representation is your expertise. The particular process and method by which you are currently achieving that might need to transform. I think there's always going to be a place for really good work on information layout and on understanding what kinds of information layouts need to be consistent across, for example, screens, or can be changed across screens to signal something different, or where the representational format might need to change. So, for example, from a screen to a sound as I move from my phone to my car. And I actually think a lot of the work that's been being done to lay out user interfaces has embedded within it, but may not have been fully articulated, the deep expertise of what works and what does not work. So you might, the work practice and process might well change, and it maybe should change, because the tooling is going to change. But the expertise that you have in terms of how humans interact with information for best effect, for what to create that's salient through which modality, whether it's visual or auditory or tactile, your repertoire might actually expand. And what I would say to you is to push back to you to say, you are exactly the kind of person who needs to start to demand better tooling to extend the work that you do, that is the expertise that you have, into this future space, so that we don't end up stumbling around and not doing really good cross-device, multi-representational format user interfaces. Because I would argue that with all of the expertise that you have, the abstracted expertise about human interaction with information is the really important one that we need to take into thinking about this distributed, screen space that we're coming to, and distributed modality space. But the tooling and those processes might well change. But there are always going to be interfaces and interactions that are very specific and need to be designed to very specific requirements. That's always going to be the case. It's just that there's this bigger world where our expertise I want to have in place to think about how we do that well and don't stumble that, which might mean extending the tooling. Does that answer your question?
Are you still nervous?
I'm generally nervous, you know that.
But I think you actually bring up another point, which this is something that's always sort of worried me a little bit, which is when we say user experience is made up of a lot of different tools and techniques. And you talked about a very specific kind of user experience production. And I think that what I have been really talking about more is the bigger picture of that, within which this sits as an expertise. And I think one of the things that we get hung up on is being experts at tools, rather than being experts at what the tools allow us to execute on, and we forget to articulate our expertise. And I think there's a lot of people I know who, you know, sell themselves as like, I'm an XYZ tool expert. And then I unpack, and the folks who are really, really, really good, who you want to keep going back to and working with and hiring, are the ones who, you might push them a little bit, who articulate why they use this particular thing here and there, and what the salient things are for people, and how information representation and the multiple pages, and how you distribute what content happens on which page, and how you make sure that there are no seams between the pages that are cognitively challenging. That's what they're actually doing. And you know, they'll pick up the new tools to do that, but what I'm asking you and challenging you back for is help us make sure we get those tools right. Help us make sure that we do that. Because you know, your nerves actually is a sign that I should be working with you to find out what do we need to take forward to make sure that the tooling is right so that you can move into this new space. Because I want your expertise.
Thank you. A question?
Yep. My question to Elizabeth is, how would you teach AI entities which value systems to pay attention to?
How would I teach AI entities? That is a critical question, and again, it's a question that, you know, it's a massive scope, right? So, what do you mean by AI entity?
So, say for instance, somehow it becomes self-aware, and what kind of value systems does it pay attention to when it is dealing or interacting with humans or society in general? Say we've got religion, we've got all these other value systems contained within the internet.
I think, you know, every technology has value systems embedded within it, and some of them are coherent and some of them are not. Some of them are intentionally built in, and others are not. You know, I worked on dating services for a while, and you know, the algorithmic work of who you surfaced as a match for who, and who you know, how you match people up, and what values you have around what the ultimate outcome is. I mean, that's embedded value systems, right? That, you know, there's one particular service which is very specifically focused on the outcome being heterosexual marriage, right? And you can algorithmically manage that. And then there's another one which, you know, that's exactly not what they're trying to do. They're actually trying to get people who want to be casual hookups together, right? So all systems have values embedded within them, some of them explicitly that are actually sold as a value add, you know, as an attractor, and some artificially or whatever. And I think your question really is a bigger question than that, which is how will we know when a set of values and ethics are being reinforced? And will we be able to question that, change it, offset it, and understand, you know, how to surface it and correct it, and who gets to say what correction looks like? And the only answer I have for you is that we have to be alert to the fact that that is potentially happening, and that it's going to be on a case-by-case solution basis. But we have to have this conversation. There was some great, I was trying to think who it was, I think it might have been Bruce Shire on security, who was saying that these are enormous problems that don't have single solutions. But if we don't talk about them, and we don't keep critically asking the question, then we're not going to move forward at all. And so one of the other things that HCI and UX people take on is an advocacy role. And I know it's very difficult in a job situation to raise the question around, you know, the ethics of something. Data collection is a great one. So back to the data and design stuff I was talking about, I think one of our roles is to say, what data are you collecting and why in this thing that we're building? What happens to that data? I'm very, you know, keen on and excited about and involved in thinking about, not so much in my current role, but historically, how long does user data get kept? Why is it being collected? If you look at most of these mobile devices, they're collecting all kinds of data. And I'm not saying that there's any conspiracy theory or any kind of intentional negativity. It's because often when the designed experiences are happening, it's like nobody even thinks that they know what the data are. Why is this sensor collecting this thing and it's on or it's off and I don't quite, we're just gathering it, right? But we're getting smarter about those conversations. And so the long answer is really, I'm really happy you raised that as a question. And I think there are some very, very near-term ethical issues around keeping the conversation around that going. And then there are some bigger philosophical issues and deeply technical issues around how do we as a society or a set of societies start to intervene around the morals and ethics that are being embedded within or being learned within these systems.
Hello. I think that was a really great discussion, and you raised some really amazing points about data collection and the ethical, quandary around that. And I was actually wondering what your thoughts are on the new AI Barbie, which, that seems really spooky to me, that it's listening and learning all the time. I'm just interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Anything that's listening and learning all of the time is not awesome. And if it's packaged as a Barbie, it's even more not awesome. just like mortification, really. And I think the bigger picture there is really, I said something about transparency. And for that particular, so I'm going to make a general point about the packaging of something that appears to be interactional, educational, and benign because it sits within a commercial space that inherits a lot of assumptions around sort of benign play, whatever, is a problem for me personally, because it's signaling a kind of interaction that may in fact not be the interaction that ends up happening. But that being said, Barbie in many, many forms has been not considered benign. So, so the fact that it's the Barbie specifically is not surprising to me. But I do think you're raising a bigger question, which is about the masquerading of play and benign, which in fact might not be. And it comes to that great question, which is about the ethics there. Why is Barbie doing this? For what ends? What are we trying to have Barbie learn and bring and produce? And I think, if we replace Barbie with the fridge, remember the Internet of Things, it's always the blooming talking fridge, right? But then, I'm also thinking about, the fridge that won't let me open the door because it decides I'm overweight, right? Or, I had too much Sauvignon Blanc yesterday and you're not getting any more. I mean, it's just, where do we start to say that these interactions are in our benefit rather than not? What's trying to be achieved? So I'm really pleased you brought that up because I was like, oh yeah, blooming heck.
It's another question.
Yeah.
Just a question mainly about, obviously you work for these large companies and you collect a lot of data on, I'd say, general user base, and then you make decisions based on that. One of the things that I've been interested in quite recently is contextual experiences. So just to simplify it as much as I can, if we've got two users on a screen, one's left-handed, one's right-handed, would I provide a left-handed experience or a right-handed experience? I mean, there's no way for me to generalize immediate data for that kind of thing for individual experiences. Have you worked with anything that's very contextual for Google or anyone else in the past? And if you have, would you mind talking about that kind of thing? So do you collect individual data sets for users and then apply an experience to them? That's something I feel that would maybe be somewhere we'd probably head in the future.
Yeah, and I have not worked on anything like that for Google. I did some experimental prototypes for Yahoo, which was actually based on the dating work, which was, we did this sort of map, which was a mashup back in the days when people called them mashups. And it was much more kind of contextualized. So the way we set it up was, say, I said that people planning dates is really hard, and so what we did was we mashed up a map with a bunch of chat stuff and whatever, and then we would make recommendations based on the two people who were talking. And we actually sort of, we sort of kludged it as a demonstrator of the value of that. And the people who used it were all signed up, testers who tried it out. And so that was trying to contextualize, a little bit of what you like, and what do we know about you and you've said about yourself, and a little bit about your interlocutors, what their preferences are. And then we would sort of send out searches to the Yahoo search engine and like make recommendations for you for places to go. So that was sort of contextualized to a sort of dyadic overlap of interests, which we were trying to do a very small and specialized and specific version of what collaborative filtering does at scale in a sort of aggregated, anonymous way, right? And we also tried to do that a little bit with shopping, using your sort of social media data. And again, it was a prototype that was, with people with consenting information, and we just tried it out to see what it would look like. And so I think for certain kinds of tasks and activities where people are sort of consenting and they understand the value for them, this is the way of the future. And but I just worry about us being very careful that we're not collecting that very specific data on you. And all of the corporations I've worked in have been incredibly good at separating out personally identifiable information with your data sets. And so because of the infrastructure issues of the ways in which these systems work and the data that get collected, and now the ethical and legal issues which are appropriate around data management, in fact, most of the aggregated stuff, you don't ever get that kind of, to your point, very personal thing. And so now what we want to do, what one wants to do as an industry, I'm not working on this, is think about how that can be managed at a much more personal level, and perhaps managed by individuals themselves or something around, their data. So I think you're right about it, and I've done some really small experiments just to show and demonstrate the value of it. But in all cases, it was sort of abutting a set of legal and ethical issues because the infrastructure for the data collection was not fit for that purpose or built for that purpose. But if one looks at things like gaming platforms, and one looks at things like tutoring systems, where people are actually signed up to have that very personal experience, I think it works quite well. And then the trick becomes, how do you algorithmically match the general to the very specific and make sure you're keeping that person's personal experience very, in their own control. But I think you're right, that is the way to go once we kind of know how to do it.
Elizabeth, I'm going to ask you a question about, we've talked about those new to the area, but there are others who have perhaps been in the area for quite a long time and work perhaps with large organisations, and now you're in a position, you're in a position where you can start to influence change through your organisation. So perhaps some thoughts on starting on how to best enable some of these ideas and how to get them to propagate through an organisation. And you rightly say that people working in HCI are not just reactive, they're proponents of change, or at least in partnership with change. So some of these ideas sometimes run into conflict or hit organisational structures, and you might hit marketing departments, or you might hit other people who might start to have different ways of looking at this. So your thoughts about how to enable some of these changes through an organisation?
Well, I've always worked in organisations. I've been very lucky and privileged where I've worked in organisations where actually very receptive to user experience research and UI work. But any situation comes up where there's sort of if there's a conflict, here's what we recommend and this is what you want to build. It's like any situation, you have to provide the right communication tools and the right rationale. So do evidence-based reasoning to try and persuade someone that your approach is the better approach. So that's on a specific case-by-case basis. And you're not going to win everything all of the time. But I think there's a bigger thing, which is why I was saying, please, be in the community, be a vocal community, because there's nothing more powerful than being able to go into a meeting and say, look, we have evidence and data here that this design decision might not be the right one. We'd like to put out a test to see which one might work, and here's the hypotheses around this. But there's also this enormous body of evidence over here and people talking about this that we might want to take into consideration. So I think in an organization, the tools of persuasion are kind of prior experience and evidence, and or a good process for saying what the hypotheses are and then follow up about it. I think the worst situation, the worst place to be in is where you have a lot of work that gets done and never revisited and never looked at again. And then we just keep reinventing the wheel over and over and over again. And that's why I say be active in a community, listen to people, send out a message to the community and say, has anybody seen anything on such and such? And you don't have to give away too much, because you can couch it in the kinds of, the generalities of what you need to do, not the specifics of the work asked. But I also think recruit others in the organization. There are very few organizations where there isn't at least one other person who, when you start to say, it's really interesting what the humans do, that they're not going to be interested in what the humans do. I was talking about this today in the doctoral consortium. I always believe that there are sort of two major human motivations. One's vanity and the other one's voyeurism. And if you can actually show what other people are doing and why that's super interesting and exciting, you're going to be able to recruit people. And then once you have your first win where you show that something happened and you had an influence, this is one thing I'll say, do not hide your light under a bushel. Is that the right way to say it? Yeah, that's the phrase. One of the things that is we're not good at narrating our successes, and not everybody, but a lot of people I work with do amazing work, and then they're not good at narrating it and taking a claim for it. And say, by the way, that was my insight. Did you notice that? And that came from data, and that came from evidence, and from our user experience research. Or I have, decades worth of experience in UI, specification for the earlier question. And actually the insight that I just, gave you was based in a lot of years of research, and I brought that to the table, and thank you very much. You don't have to be a bore about it. But, look to your successes and talk about them. And that way someone else who maybe has got a bit of a success might be able to piggyback on your story. But I think there's a lot of work that gets done that's really good work that just never gets narrated and discussed. I mean, within your organization where the proprietary issues aren't a concern, right, even.
There was a question back there.
Just earlier when you were talking about mental models and creating or breaking mental models, you did mention educating a user to interrogate the system. I was wondering if you had any examples of that you could talk about.
Oh, sure. So when the first browsers came out, web browsers, it all looked like it was, ooh, this is very, I'm interacting with, stuff that's being basically marked up. HTML, and it's being rendered, and I'm looking at pictures or whatever it might be. And I think the best thing that ever happened was when you could go in and you could actually look at the HTML, right? So now I can actually look at the source, and I think that changed. I mean, that capability was what allowed so many people who had not had technical, and this is just my opinion, I might be wrong, but this was my opinion at the time, so many people who had not had a technical background suddenly could go and have a look at the HTML and see the patterns and reproduce and recreate. And so in a really simplistic way, that was what I mean by interrogate the system. You can take off the front layer and you can have a look underneath and you can go, holy cow, I think I can do that. And I think that's fantastic. Now as we sort of scale that up, I would love to be able to, I don't know, actually, there's applications that do this now, but you sort of have a look at your phone or whatever. You look at all of the, there's a bunch of research applications that have come out. Have a look at all of the apps that are doing anything with data. There's this beautiful work that's coming up on permissioning, and there's a bunch of prototypes that I'm trying to think. I can't remember which university it was that were doing, but they're starting to surface in really nice user interfaces all of the apps that are on your phone that basically have permissions set to, be collecting your data or to be giving your location away or whatever. And all they're doing is they're doing nice user interfaces on an interrogation, which is just having a look at, oh, what apps do you have on your phone? Here are the ones that seem to be active in the following way. Suddenly I can interrogate, I can have a look and say, who's doing what? Dear apps, what are you all doing with my stuff? And then I can go and choose to turn stuff off. And as we sort of scale that up, I think you're allowing people to build a mental model, you're allowing people to have the tools to have a look, and you might be actually onboarding them to think about what else they might want to do. So when I was talking about novices and experts, and I was thinking about, the sort of Internet of Things or whatever, we're starting to, get things like Nest devices and other devices in the home, and it's getting more and more important that we can actually have a look at those and see, what are you doing? And so it's a bit like looking at the HTML. It's a bit like saying, dear device number 5, what are you up to? So that's kind of more what I mean. And I'm very keen on, sort of open source projects that allow you to go in and tinker around and build stuff. Not everybody wants to do it, but you can really start to see, how people can start playing with things in a different way. There's a lovely website called Software Carpentry, and it's a bunch of folks at UC Davis who they're doing really nice, simple tutorials for social scientists. And the way they're talking about it is, let me tell you why GitHub would be useful for your science. And then suddenly you're using GitHub, which is very different from coming in and saying, I'm a coder and I love GitHub because it's exactly this kind of thing and I want to be in this culture. It starts to become a tool, but then a lot of people start to use it as a tool, start to use more capabilities of the tool, and then start to be more involved in forums, so bringing people in.
Question in there?
I think this is going to have to be our last one.
Okay.
Thanks.
And then I'm going to ask all you a question.
I thought there was one.
Actually, can we draw a line, because to give Elizabeth time to ask her question, and it is 7:30. We've been going for an hour, and I'm sure Elizabeth's feeling thirsty, and we're all thirsty. So, Elizabeth, you can let us know your question, and we'll respond to that.
Well, I'm sort of going to pick up on one of your points, which is can I have a show of hands of how many people consider themselves to be seasoned UX people in this room? Okay, so there's quite a lot of people who are sort of new. So the people who are more new, how many of you are starting out on a career? Okay, good. How many of you are thinking of starting out on a career? Okay, excellent. So for the ones who are starting out on a career, I'd just like a couple of questions thrown in on breaking the rules. What were you hoping to get from this tonight? Just somebody shout something out. Who's new, who's trying to get into this as a career? Okay,
Be brave.
Don't be shy.
A job, someone said.
So no, I think a job is, I think that's really important. And the reason I'm asking is because I keep harping on about this being a community, and I keep harping on about this actually being a place where you can get jobs. But if you make this community work as a vibrant community, being that proactive and join and be part of it, you're already vibrant, obviously. But one of the things we need to do is start inventing the jobs. And I've talked about us not articulating what we do loudly enough. I've talked about how your work might transform, but there are really important aspects of what you do that are beyond the tooling and the processes. But I also think that this landscape is getting more and more open around inventing the next career trajectories. And I think as a culture, as a set of societies, if we ever really had that romantic vision of the job for life that you just stayed in forever, which some industries may still have, the technology world is, we know this, not like that. And I think a lot of the methods that we're inventing, I think a lot of this issue around how data and design come together to do not just interface and interaction design, but actually society design. We need to talk to each other about what are the jobs of the future that we're going to be inventing, and how we're going to lead that and sell that and talk about it and talk about why it's important. Now, I've just laid out a few things that I think are really interesting challenges and opportunities as this emerging Internet of Things world is happening. But that there are a lot of other situations, education, how do we evaluate educational outcomes in the world of online learning that's global? How do we start to understand, I'll just use search as an example, word-based search and literacy around not just knowing the words, but knowing how we are literate, knowing how to ask for information. What about all of that, the next billion users or whatever, who have a different kind of literacy? How do we adapt to them, and how do we onboard and cooperate going forward? I just see so many opportunities, and our traditional methods are good for some things, but we need to invent new methods to understand how to take technology to the next level, to get to that dream where we're not helping our users be really good at using our things, but we're helping our users be the best users they want to be. And that's a much bigger challenge, and a much more exciting challenge that takes a lot of the small building blocks, but it has a bigger story attached to it. And I don't think any of us can take the whole story on by ourselves. And so if there isn't a job right now, think about, some piece that you can do, but think about what you're really passionate about, what you think, where you can make a difference, and let's invent that job.
Yeah.
What wonderful advice. Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Well, I would definitely like to do this again. Would anybody else like to do this again? Yeah. So I'm so gratified that you talked about the value of community and collaboration, because UX Melbourne is all about, hey guys, let's have a community, let's talk to each other, let's meet with each other and stimulate and challenge each other. And there's always opportunity with UX Melbourne for new people to get involved and have new ideas and have a vision for something that you want to carry and get some help with that. But also I think it's important that we develop a community with formal HCI research. And I know that Frank, he's donated his time and Elizabeth's time to us as jobbing UXers in Melbourne, and I know that he would love to have this conversation and this community and this dialogue continue, and I've got some ideas about how we could maybe keep some of the momentum. Let's not lose what we've enjoyed tonight. Let's try and sustain some of that energy. And I think what Elizabeth said in terms of, it's the new technologies that we have to be thinking about, and we have to start to explore and envisage. I don't think that we can do that just as jobbing UX practitioners. I think we need the formal research community to help do that, to challenge a lot of the assumptions that we operate on, but also for us to be exposed to what's the over-the-horizon technology, what's coming. And you actually get to see a lot of that, a lot of how people are exploring that in the formal research community and going to places like OzChi. So I would definitely recommend that if you can't go for the whole program, you can go for 1 day, you can go for 2 days. So do yourself a favour and turn up one this year or next year and have a chat to people who are working with some really amazing technologies. So thank you very much. I think everybody's ready for a drink. I'm sure Frank and Elizabeth are. So can we just say thank you again, and thank you to our sponsors. Through the back door. If someone will, if you can open that would be great. There's a beer station, there's a red wine station, there's a bubble station, there's a water station, and please continue to